experts in Russia and UK. He is an associate fellow and former head of the Russia and Eurasia program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. He was a fellow of the Coflict Studies Research Centre of the Ministry of Defense from 1995 to 2008. He has extensively published on Soviet and Russian military, security, and foreign policy, and he recently has spent some time in Ukraine. So,
thank you.
The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. You might not believe this, but I'm a very punctual person. The fact is that I got lost in this building, so you could have been waiting for longer while I explored all of its different galleries and exhibitions. Thank you very much for your invitation. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. Now, can everyone hear me properly? Good. About 6 months before the Russia-Georgia war began in 2008, I expressed the view that Russia was a proud, resentful, apprehensive, and ambitious power. On the eve of the conflict in Ukraine, one could have said this again, but one would have said more proud, more resentful, more apprehensive, more ambitious. Before the Russia-Georgia conflict, there were many I had to speak to who were quite insistent that Russia would never use overt military force against one of its neighbors, and the main reason for saying that was that it hadn't happened before. Before the first Green Men appeared in Crimea, a month before its annexation, or what Russians like to call вхождение в состав Российской Федерации, the response to suggestions from me and a couple of other people that an intervention in Crimea was quite likely was, no, it's very improbable, and the main reason was, well, nothing like this has happened before. With that step and in what has followed, the leaders of Russia today have torn up the rule book. They have torn up every single significant multilateral and bilateral treaty and agreement that defined and for the West represented the end of the Cold War, and for us, led us to conclude that the Cold War is over. So, how one characterizes the current situation it's not very easy to do so, but one has to begin by saying that today there is no international law in Europe east of the Nysa River. There are simply balances or imbalances of force and various processes of discussion and negotiation. My purpose this morning is to explain how Russia got to where it is. That's my main purpose, how it got this way, and secondly, to explain from a military political angle what it is actually doing about it and why. If this were an academic lecture about Russia's geopolitical outlook and tradition, I would have started with all of the habits and disciplines and methods and approaches that began to fall into place during Russia's 260-year encounter with the Tatar Mongols, but that is not the lecture I'm giving today. What I do want to say at the outset is that important as Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is, and as powerful as he is in Russia, what we are looking at is not simply or even fundamentally the consequences of the aims and thinkings of one man or one leadership group. We are looking, in a particular circumstance, at interests and approaches to the outside world that had their origin and gestation long before the Bolsheviks came to power. There is a Tsarist and even pre-Tsarist pedigree in a lot of the dilemmas that Russia faces and the ambitions that it has. But let's just look at the post-Soviet period for the sake of time. And let me make 4 points, which ought to be obvious, but unfortunately, in many parts of Europe, they're not. The first is that for 20 years, the Russian Federation has officially, not privately, informally, covertly, officially, openly, equated its own security with the limited sovereignty of its neighbors. And this has been expressed in one form of words or another since 1992, sometimes under the auspices of the MFA, sometimes under the auspices of the MOD, sometimes under the auspices of the presidency. Secondly, the Russian military establishment at the end of the Cold War was an establishment that still in the 1990s regarded NATO by definition as an aggressive, anti-Russian military bloc. And I note in passing that the efforts undertaken under Mikhail Gorbachev to put the culture of this military establishment under scrutiny and change it came to a halt when Boris Yeltsin became president, not because he was a covert Dzержavnik, a great power ideologue, not because he was anti-Western, he certainly was not, but because his criteria of appointing people to that system was personal loyalty to him, and it was of secondary importance whether they were real reformers or not. And so the reformers that coalesced around Gorbachev found themselves very swiftly marginalized, and you were left with a fairly unreformed institution. And if you look at the security structures, most notably what we used to call the KGB, almost entirely unreformed. Changes, purges, were confined to those who supported the coup in 1991. So you have a security establishment that is absolutely, largely unchanged in its thinking, and again towards NATO, fundamentally suspicious because this is the way NATO is viewed. The view expressed by NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, at NATO's founding, even then, at the height of the Cold War, at a time we were afraid that we would end up with the Third World War, that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. This has never been understood. It has been seen purely as an anti-Russian, anti-Soviet instrument, and there has been great bewilderment in Russia at the end of the Cold War as to why NATO still existed. And we could argue all the reasons for why it still existed, very strong reasons. I don't have to repeat them here. You understand them perfectly well. But what I would say is that once NATO began, and I would say on NATO's part, reluctantly, the first of 3 waves of post-Cold War enlargement, that destroyed any possibility of rational argument about this inside Russia, because enlargement was seen exclusively as an anti-Russian step. I have pointed out, others have pointed out in Russia, that the key European architect of the post-Cold War Europe-Western-Russia strategic partnership, namely Germany, was also the principal European backer and engine of the first round of NATO enlargement. Not because Germany was covertly anti-Russian, but because what the Germans feared, and it was even more deeply feared in Poland, was the consequences of those states in Central Europe again becoming a gray zone, a zone of instability, a zone of competition, and the demoralizing and destabilizing effects that would have right in the middle of Europe. Good luck trying to explain this at any point in Russia. And a third point, the impact of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. Absolutely unanticipated in Moscow, because in their highly geopolitically focused and determined view of the world, the human factor, the social civic factor, as something truly independent of the state is not understood and basically doesn't exist. And so what was the default interpretation of what happened in 2004? And I assure you quite sincerely it was Putin's interpretation that this operation was instigated, led, controlled, and managed by US special services. And they were waiting for it to happen, because in the build-up to NATO's intervention in the Kosovo conflict in 1999, what the Russian military scientists saw and started commenting upon was the employment of the civic factor and the theme of human rights as a tool in geopolitical expansion. And even back then, the refrain was, this was an article in Krasnaya Zvezda, today they are bombing Serbia, but they are targeting Russia. This was seen, even back then, as a dress rehearsal on our part for what we proposed to do there in a similar environment. Where's that similar environment? The South Caucasus. So there was a straight connecting thread of thinking between Kosovo conflict, the recognition of Kosovo in 2002, and what then happened in the South Caucasus in 2008, because it's all seen as directed from the outside. As is the Western involvement in the so-called Arab Spring, particularly Libya. President Medvedev, as then he was, the man who was routinely portrayed in the West as being of this tandem, the pro-Western president, said publicly in the midst of the Libyan operation, they, meaning the United States and its allies, are planning to do the same thing to us, but not for a while. Fyodor Lukyanov, one of Russia's top geopolitical specialists, said in this connection about today's events, Ukraine has become an Arab country for us. Well, if you understand these connections they're making, you can see why he made such a statement, which otherwise would be seen as incomprehensible. The Orange Revolution not only brought home a deep elemental fear that this was the penultimate stage, the last stop on the road to hell, so to speak, before the ultimate revolution, which was a so-called white revolution in Russia itself, backed, of course, by the United States and its allies. And I assure you today, whoever bears responsibility for Boris Nemtsov's barbaric murder, this is the way a large part of the political class will immediately interpret it. But there is something else the Orange Revolution represents, and it's very much part of today's story, and it's this. If Estonia or Latvia enters the community, the Euro-Atlantic community, adopts its values, adopts its standards, adopts its way of life, adopts its defense culture, all these other things. Very irritating for Russia. Very uncomfortable, but they can live with it. And why can they live with it? Because with the exception of the Russian community here, you are seen as чужой. You are not part of their civilization, and therefore what you do is not intrinsically contagious. But if Ukraine, a country well before Putin described repeatedly Ukrainians as the same and Russians as the same people, a country who Russians basically see as either a kindred people or the same people, if Ukraine is able to do all of this, then it has immediate internal repercussions inside Russia. And then it strengthens those people inside Russia, like Boris Nemtsov's supporters, who say, well, we can do this too. Why shouldn't we be able to do this? So the internal factor is extremely important. And the final point, as far as how we got to this stage, is the enlargement of the European Union. Russia's views about the European Union have changed. In the 1990s, Russia's views about the EU were very sympathetic and benign. Why? Because they wrongly perceived that the EU is a geopolitical project dedicated against the United States and was designed to establish a counterbalance to US influence in Europe, and therefore Russia and the EU could work together. By the beginning of this century, more and more people were beginning to understand that that's not basically what the EU is. The EU is a project of integration. It's a project of integration, again, on the basis of all these norms, all these institutions, all these standards, all these values that actually connect Europe quite closely to the countries of North America, but which are very different from those that exist in Russia, whose system has been described by leading Russian analysts who have worked in leading institutions there as patrimonial, network rather than rules-based, and neo-feudal. And so the EU, as it is enlarged, began by some people to be seen as being as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than NATO enlargement, because what the EU is interested in is not the external policy of countries, it's interested in the internal policy of countries. And it is really bottom-up, and it is a mechanism for wholesale internal transformation. This is an extremely profound threat to a country that believes that, as Lenin put it so well, there is nothing more fallacious than the distinction between internal and external policy. So the people who ran Russia, and this was even true in the later stages of the 90s when Boris Yeltsin was still there, viewed the enlargement of the EU as the EU is representing a new form of Iron Curtain moving east. Not just in the form of Schengen, but all sorts of other things behind Schengen. And so what I would ask you to understand, now go back and look at what Vladimir Putin said to George Bush in 2008, after NATO's conference in Bucharest. He said, if NATO joins Ukraine, it will put the existence of the state in question. Substitute, please, the word NATO for the word EU for NATO, and you will understand what has been taking place. Let me now turn to, I've said I'm going to talk for 45 minutes. I think I've talked for 18 of them so far. Let me now turn to the Ukraine conflict and the backdrop to it. Well, that is the backdrop to it. As Viktor Yanukovych, a figure who was neither pro-Russian nor pro-European, a figure who simply wanted to transform Ukraine into a resource base for him, his family, and a narrow group of key interests, proceeded for very narrow reasons to first conclude an EU association agreement and then proceed towards its signature. As this process got underway, parallel to it, Russian pressure began to Kremlin's pressure began to increase. And before the Vilnius summit, if you remember this, of November 2013, just before all of this, a team of experts that were assembled under Sergei Glaziev to analyze the Ukrainian economy and all its interconnections and vulnerabilities. Its summary was leaked, and then Putin had a meeting with Yanukovych in Sochi, and he basically said to him, if you sign this accord, I will break your legs. What he said in detail was here, and he pointed at all the folders. These are all the respects in which your economy is very vulnerable to our decisions. And here even are the areas most important to you personally with the greatest financial ties to your interests, and I assure you, in all these documents, there are steps I just need only to push a button and we could just destroy your economy. And some others who were in the room and some who were not in the room have also suggested, I cannot confirm it, but it makes sense, that he might also have threatened, if you do this, I will have to take preventive measures in Crimea. And Yanukovych left that room shaking. And in December that year, he gave in to Putin on every point of substance. But even before then, I was in Kiev the day Prime Minister Azarov issued a decree breaking off the negotiation process with the EU. This had its desired effect. And in December, when all these accords were signed with Russia, the senior Russian officials who were there negotiating all this, and there was Mr. Miller from Gazprom, and there was Mr. Lavrov, and everybody was there, and they were happy to say to everybody in front of cameras, television cameras, Ukraina nasha. Ukraine is now ours. Well, ladies and gentlemen, 2 months later, Yanukovych is overthrown and Russia finds overnight it has no influence in Ukraine at all. What do you expect to happen? That's what we are looking at. But what happened didn't just happen that minute. So let me explain something that I think which I trust would be well appreciated, particularly by the serving military officers who are here. There is a big controversy today as to when the invasion of Crimea was planned. Well, I think all of you understand very well that there is, in any defense system, a distinction drawn between planning, which occurs regarding many plausible contingencies over a long period of time, and actual decisions by command authorities to take certain actions. The same is certainly true here. I have no doubt that plans for a military takeover of Crimea were drawn up as, I would say, as late as the Russia-Georgian War. There would be some that would have been drawn up when the Soviet Union was breaking up. No question at all. But when was the decision actually taken to do this? From my reading of the tea leaves, probably not until the third week of January, which is still several weeks before Yanukovych fell from power. That much I think most people would understand, because in this sense the Russian system looks a lot like the system of defense planning in a NATO country. Now here's the difference. When you draw up a contingency plan in the Russian defense system, it's not just a contingency plan. You start working on it immediately, okay? So for example, in 2009, Dmitry Medvedev, before the General Assembly of the UN, referred to the Arctic as a theater of potential future military conflict. Bingo. That said to me and a number of others, they have designated this area a TVD, meaning a theater of military activity. And although they have no plans to do certain things, what you saw immediately there was a heightening of all kinds of Russian activity, naval, air, covert, overt, mapping, probing, all of this, okay? Same thing with Ukraine. When Yanukovych was out and the new authorities came in, they discovered some very interesting things had taken place. First, they had discovered that over a period of months, perhaps years, the Russians who had always penetrated and tried to penetrate military institutions in Ukraine, security institutions, intelligence institutions, were also penetrating law enforcement, particularly in eastern Ukraine, with their people, but more than that, gradually by stages, adding subsidies and allowances to the salaries of officers in law enforcement in eastern Ukraine, going on under everybody's noses for months and possibly years, to a greater and greater extent through the Russian banking system. What they also discovered is that in the weeks before Yanukovych was toppled, first of all, it was quite clear that as of December, the SBU, the Ukrainian security services, were taking their orders directly from Moscow. President and structures no longer had any de facto authority over them or knew what was going on there. In the days before what happened, the weeks before also, the final operations, the most bloody and gory operations of the Ukrainian Berkut, the special police, were being coordinated by a man who, until recently, was general, was a first deputy head of Russian GRU, who was based in a hotel suite in Kiev. Days before, the Moscow's helpers wiped all the communications records, all the personnel records of the SBU. I am quite sure they copied them first, but it meant that the new heads of the SBU in Ukraine not only had no knowledge about who was in the agentura, they didn't even know who they employed in the normal staff. And they discovered also that the command and control networks in the armed forces had been basically ripped up and compromised, all communications completely compromised. Many of us have stories of people we know in Crimea who had to ring up their friends in normal flats on an ordinary telephone line saying, will you please take a message over to the Ministry of Defense, because nothing was working. So what you were looking at there, and this is part of what NATO is looking at now and has to look at now, is that you are talking about, in a modern form, something the Soviets were always interested in and something which existed before, which is a model of conflict that is designed to incapacitate a state before that state even knows that the conflict has started. This is what they mean when they talk about начало период войны, the initial period of war. It's the initial period. When they say it's the initial period, we don't know it's the initial period until it's too late. And I said this is not entirely new. When Marshal Tukhachevsky was describing in 1931 the aim of the doctrine of deep operations, he said the aim of this is to bring about the collapse of the state and of the enemy's society in the shortest period of time. And what this goes hand in hand with is a huge 15-year investment of intellectual and institutional resources in информационная борьба and информационная война. What's the difference? Информационная борьба, information struggle, that term борьба has a very specific meaning to a Russian military or security professional. It refers to adversarial activity in time of peace as well as war, whereas информационная война, information war, is simply about the use of information as a weapon in war itself. Given that distinction, it's particularly interesting that even this narrower concept of information war is described in the following terms in the concept of the information space, authored by the Ministry of Defense in 2011. They say the aim of information operations is the undermining of the political, economy, and social system and massive indoctrination of an enemy, of course, for destabilizing the state and also forcing society, and also forcing the state to make decisions in the interests of the opposing party. Refleksivnaya vojna, refleksivnaya upravlение, reflexive control. This is what is meant by it. Look at what preceded the latest accords in Minsk. We had a new, much larger, much more ferocious military offensive in Ukraine, in which the distinctive component was not so much the fresh reinforcements of Russian regular and not so regular forces in the conflict, but the appearance for the first time of weapon systems and electronic warfare capabilities which are state-of-the-art inside the Russian military system, and which swiftly blinded, deafened, and neutralized and destroyed Ukrainian resistance. That was not part of the script that Angela Merkel was envisaging when she was taking what was unmistakably a very consistent and very tough role over sanctions. And then we also know that around the edges, and you have seen this even before then, a lot of very nasty, provocative activity taking place, and nuclear saber rattling of various kinds. And as Putin himself said, many private telephone calls with Angela Merkel before suddenly, with no warning, she and François Hollande decided that something needed to be done, and she descended with him upon Kiev and then Moscow. Well, I would suggest to you that that military offensive in Ukraine in January was as much a new offensive in information war as in war, designed to achieve a political end. Let me just conclude, because I think I've spoken long enough. Obviously, there's a lot I haven't covered, which I hope we can cover in questions, by saying the following. Whether or not the Kremlin has a strategic approach depends on how you define the term strategic. But what I would say is that what has caught us off balance is that there are two other things going on. First of all, when it comes to anything important, what they have is a holistic approach. We tend to look at, you talk about the information dimension, even to people who are deeply concerned about it, in this part of the world, and particularly in countries like Britain, and what they think you're talking about is propaganda. And if you're talking about war and even hybrid war, they think you're talking about something else. And they think diplomacy is still about something else. They don't understand that these are parts of a whole. These are not compartmented in this way, they are reinforced. Secondly, there is a strategic understanding by any standards in one sense. Understanding the strategic importance and dynamics of time. Time as a critical commodity and factor in warfare. Now, if you are sitting in the Kremlin, even though I assure you to this day, President Putin's nerves react very slowly and very poorly to economic stimuli, but even he understands that the Russian economy today, under the impact of sanctions and low oil prices, is under pressure that cannot be sustained for more than 2 years at most before the state loses the ability to perform many of its most essential functions, and I would say 2 years at most. So he knows in any prolonged contest, time does not work on Russia's side. It works on the West's side. But what he also understands, he understands something our leaders have not thought about sufficiently, that in the short term, time works on his side, particularly in Ukraine. I was told by a regime ideologist last November in St. Petersburg, it's like, don't worry, James, he said, by next winter there will be no Ukraine. Well, this thinking is well advanced in Russia. I assure you, have these conversations seen as the most normal thing in the world. It's quite clear also that I think from the time it was clear also from the time Yanukovych looked as if he might not make it through. Putin shifted the whole focus from controlling all of Ukraine to wrecking it. And the aim in Ukraine very clearly is to wreck it, to take what is ours, eastern Ukraine, to leave western Ukraine to deal with itself. Again, it's not our civilizational space, we couldn't care less. The Poles can take them, the EU could take them, they can become independent, the young fascists can have the torchlight parades, the intellectuals can go off and talk themselves to death. We don't care what happens to western Ukraine. It's the Russian view of it. But then you're left with a center of the country which cannot be viable, and whatever happens there, and however unviable and unsustainable it is, the West is going to pay. So I was also told there, James, we're going to do you a great favor. We're going to give you this mess. Well, this can be done in a relatively short period of time, not in 2 years. If the West does not raise its game and change it, the country can be wrecked in a matter of months. That's what we're looking at. The strategic incongruity on our part is the following. The sanctions, as I've said, are a very effective long-term weapon. By the end of their course, game over. But the people, most of the governments of Europe who have supported them, including François Hollande's government, have done so on the assumption, which came out of nowhere but wishes, that it would change Russian behavior in a matter of weeks or months. Well, you could see it hasn't. It's only done so in the sense of making them worse, because what they're doing is they are responding to their advantages at the expense of our disadvantages. And this is what asymmetrical warfare is all about. You build a contest which is decided by your strengths and somebody else's weaknesses. And that is exactly what they're doing. Now, very last point, and I will stop. Provocatively, I've told you then what the political aim is in Ukraine. For everything they're doing, there is always a political aim. So what is the political aim today in the Baltic states? I would say it is to persuade everyone who matters here that at the end of the day, if your countries upset Russia and Russia reacts, there is nothing that the EU and NATO can do to help you, and they won't. What is the primary weapon being used to achieve that aim? In a word, fear. That's why when I wrote about the Minsk diplomacy on the eve of the Minsk negotiation in Ukraine for the paper Zerkalo Nedeli, Mirror of the Week, I titled it The Triumph of Fear. Well, all I could say is let's hope clear, sober thinking rather than fear triumphs here. Thanks a lot.